Hi, I'm Bob. We will continue to solve the exercises in Chapter 2 today. We have arrived at the part of the effects of a sales tax. I will do my best to show you the step-by-step solutions to the problems. If it helps, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you. Let's do exercise 6.1. What effect does a $1 specific tax have on equilibrium price and quantity? And what is the incidence on consumers if the following is true? In part 1, the demand curve is perfectly inelastic. As shown in the graph, the perfectly inelastic demand curve, D, is vertical at Q1. The upward sloping supply curve, S1, intersects the demand curve at the pre-tax equilibrium, E1. The specific tax of $1 shifts the supply curve upward by $1 from S1 to S2. The intersection of the demand curve and the new supply curve determines the after-tax equilibrium, E2, where the price consumers pay is P2 equals P1 plus 1. The price firms receive is P1, and the quantity is Q2 equals Q1. So, the equilibrium price increases by $1. The equilibrium quantity is unchanged. The incidence of the tax on consumers is 1. We can see it from the graph or calculate it using the formula. The incidence of the tax on firms is 0. Consumers pay the entire tax because they are perfectly inelastic and must purchase a fixed quantity, no matter how high the price. In part 2, the demand curve is perfectly elastic. As shown in the graph, the perfectly elastic demand curve is horizontal at P1. The pre-tax equilibrium is E1. It is the intersection of the demand curve and the pre-tax supply curve. The pre-tax equilibrium quantity is Q1. Suppose the tax is imposed on the firms. The unit tax of $1 shifts the supply curve upward by $1. The intersection of the after-tax supply curve and the demand curve determines the after-tax equilibrium, E2, where the equilibrium quantity is Q2. The price consumers pay is P1, and the price firms receive is P1 minus 1. The incidence of the tax on consumers is 0. The incidence of the tax on firms is 1. The firms pay the entire tax because the consumers are perfectly elastic and will not accept any price above P1. Firms have to sell products at P1 and absorb the entire tax. For part C, the supply curve is perfectly inelastic. The perfectly inelastic supply curve is a vertical line at Q1. It intersects the pre-tax demand curve at E1, where the equilibrium price is P1. Suppose the tax is imposed on consumers. The specific tax shifts the demand curve downward by $1 from D1 to D2. At the after-tax equilibrium, the consumers pay P2 to firms and $1 to the government. So consumers pay a total of P2 plus 1 equal to P1. The firms receive P1 minus 1. The equilibrium quantity is unchanged. The incidence of the tax on consumers is 0. The incidence of the tax on firms is 1. The firms pay the entire tax because they have to supply a fixed amount of products, even though the tax increases their cost. In Part D, the supply curve is perfectly elastic. The perfectly elastic supply curve is horizontal at price 1 before tax. The intersection of the demand curve D and the pre-tax supply curve S1 determines the pre-tax equilibrium E1. Suppose the tax is imposed on firms. The specific tax shifts the supply curve upward by $1 from S1 to S2. The after-tax equilibrium is E2, where the price consumers pay is P2 equals P1 plus 1. The price firms receive is P2 minus 1 equals P1. And the equilibrium quantity is Q2. The incidence of the tax on consumers is 1. We can also get the result using the formula. The incidence of the tax on firms is 0. Consumers pay the entire tax because firms will not supply the good at a price that is lower than they received before the tax, P1. Thus, the consumers must pay $1 higher so that the firms receive the same price after paying the tax. As the price increases, consumers demand less and the equilibrium quantity falls. In Part E, the demand curve is perfectly elastic and the supply curve is perfectly inelastic. We now can make an educated guess of the answer. From the above exercises, we find that the more elastic party always bears a smaller tax burden. If consumers are perfectly price elastic and the firms are perfectly price inelastic, the incidence of the tax on consumers should be 0, while the firms pay the entire tax. Here is the analysis. Suppose a specific tax is imposed on consumers. They will not pay a price that is above P1, the one before the tax. So they will only pay the firms P1 minus 1 and then pay the government $1 as the tax. That is, the tax shifts the demand curve downward by $1 from D1 to D2. Firms accept any price to sell a fixed quantity of the good. Thus, at the after-tax equilibrium E2, consumers pay P1 and firms receive P1 minus 1. The incidence of the tax on consumers is 0, and that on firms is 1. We can also get the same result using the formula. Let's do exercise 6.2. We are asked to list the conditions in terms of the elasticities or shapes of supply or demand curves, consistent with 100% pass-through of the taxes to consumers. Use graphs to illustrate your answer. The last exercise shows that the more price elastic, the less tax burden. If consumers bear the entire burden of the tax, the price elasticity of demand must be 0. or the price elasticity of supply must be 1. In other words, if the demand curve is perfectly inelastic, or the supply curve is perfectly elastic, then the incidence of the tax on consumers is 1. We can also use the tax incidence on consumers formula to reach the same conclusion. Let's do exercise 6.3. We are asked to list the conditions in terms of the elasticities or shapes of supply or demand curves consistent with 0% pass-through of the taxes. Use the graph to illustrate your answer. This exercise is about the incidence of the tax on consumers, that is 0. If the price elasticity of demand is 1, or the price elasticity of supply is 0, then the entire burden of the tax falls on firms. The incidence of the tax on consumers is 0 in these two cases. The graphs are as follows. We can use the tax incidence on consumers formula to check the answer. Let's find answers to exercise 6.4. Do you care whether a 15-cent tax per gallon of milk is collected from milk producers or from consumers at the store? Why or why not? I don't care. It does not matter whether the tax is collected from milk producers or from consumers. The burden or incidence of the tax on consumers depends on the price elasticity of demand and the price elasticity of supply. We know it from the formula of the tax incidence on consumers. We can also see it from the demand and supply diagram. The left graph illustrates what happens when the tax is imposed on producers. The increase in the cost shifts the supply curve upward by the amount of the tax. The price consumers pay increases from P1 to P2. The graph on the right shows the situation when the tax is imposed on consumers. The demand curve shifts downward by the amount of the tax. The total price consumers pay is still P2 because it is the sum of the price consumers pay to the producers and the tax to the government. Let's do exercise 6.5. We use the tax incidence on consumers formula. We substitute the values of the price elasticity of supply and the price elasticity of demand into the formula and obtain the answers. The tax incidence on consumers for almonds is 96.2%, meaning that 96.2% of the tax falls on consumers. The tax incidence on consumers for cotton is 51.8%, indicating that consumers bear 51.8% of the tax. The consumer's tax incidence for processing tomatoes is 71.1%, implying that consumers pay 71.1% of the tax. Let's go to exercise 6.6. A subsidy is a negative tax through which the government gives people money instead of taking it from them. If the government applied a $1.05 specific subsidy instead of a specific tax in figure 2.12, what would happen to the equilibrium price and quantity? Use the demand function and the after-subsidy supply function to solve for the new equilibrium values. What is the incidence of the subsidy on consumers? This question is about the equilibrium effects of a specific subsidy. Suppose the subsidy is given to producers. It shifts the supply curve downward by $1.05 from S1 to S2. The supply curve shifts downwards because, for each given quantity of supply, the marginal cost of production reduces by $1.05. So, for each given price, the producers are willing to supply more of the good. The subsidy causes the equilibrium to shift from E1 to E2. The price consumers pay decreases from P1 to P2. P1 is the equilibrium price before the subsidy. P2 is lower than P1, so consumers enjoy part of the subsidy. The price producers receive is P2 plus the subsidy, which is above P1, so producers also share the subsidy. The incidence of the subsidy on consumers depends on the price elasticity of demand and the price elasticity of supply. The more inelastic, the more subsidy they receive. Let's solve exercise 6.7. Canada provided a 35% subsidy on wages of video game manufacturers' employees in 2011. In Part 1, what is the effect of a wage subsidy on the equilibrium wage and quantity of workers? Suppose the subsidy is given to the firms. It causes the labor demand curve to shift upward by an amount equal to the subsidy, because the subsidy reduces the production cost and the firms are willing to employ more workers at any given wage level. The equilibrium moves from E1 to E2. The equilibrium wage increases, and the equilibrium quantity of workers also increases. In Part B, what happens when the wage subsidy rate falls? If the subsidy rate falls, the labor demand curve will shift downward. The equilibrium wage will fall, and the equilibrium quantity of labor will also fall. In Part C, what is the incidence of the subsidy? The formula of the incidence of the subsidy on employers is as follows. Let's consider an extreme case where the labor demand is perfectly inelastic, epsilon equals 0. Then the firms have the entire subsidy. Suppose the subsidy is given to workers. The graph shows that the subsidy shifts the labor supply curve downward, and the wage firms pay decreases by the amount of the subsidy from W1 to W2. The workers receive W2 plus the subsidy, which is W1, the same as before the subsidy. Let's do exercise 6.8. Use calculus to show that the less elastic the demand curve, an increase in a specific sales tax T reduces less and tax revenue more. In the first step, we write down the incidence of the tax on consumers, dp over dt. It equals eta divided by eta minus epsilon. It means for a given 1 unit of tax, the price consumers pay increases by that amount. Now, we consider the effect of the tax on the equilibrium quantity. By the chain rule, we can write the delta Q over delta T as an expression containing eta and epsilon. A less elastic demand curve means the price elasticity of demand goes to 0 in absolute value. The algebra shows that the absolute value of dq over dt becomes smaller as the demand becomes less elastic. Notice that dq over dt is negative. A smaller absolute value means the quantity decreases less. In the second step, we consider how the tax affects the firm's revenue. The firm's revenue equals the equilibrium price times the equilibrium quantity. Using the chain rule, we have the change in the revenue with respect to the change in tax as follows. If epsilon is between -1 and 0, that is, the demand is inelastic, then the firm's revenue increases as tax increases. If epsilon is less than -1, that is, the demand is elastic, then the firm's revenue falls as tax increases. If the revenue refers to the tax revenue, then it equals T times quantity. The change in the tax revenue in response to the change in the tax is as follows. From part 1, we know that if the demand becomes less elastic, that is, if the absolute value of epsilon goes to 0, the reduction of quantity in response to the tax becomes smaller. So, the derivative of tax revenue with respect to the tax becomes larger, which means the tax revenue is higher when the tax increases by 1 unit if demand becomes less elastic. Let's go to exercise 6.9. The United Kingdom had a drinking problem. British per capita consumption of alcohol rose 19% between 1980 and 2007, compared with a 13% decline in other developed countries. Worried about excessive drinking among young people, the British government increased the tax on beer by 42% from 2008 to 2012. Under what conditions will this specific tax substantially reduce the equilibrium quantity of alcohol? Answer in terms of the elasticities of the demand and supply curves. This exercise is about how the tax affects the equilibrium quantity of beer. From the last exercise, we know that the change in the equilibrium quantity in response to a unit change in tax is as follows. When the demand curve becomes more inelastic, that is, when the price elasticity of demand approaches 0, the reduction of the quantity in response to the tax becomes smaller. In other words, the effect of the tax on quantity is smaller. when the demand is inelastic. So, the tax on beer will substantially reduce the equilibrium quantity of alcohol if the demand for beer is very elastic. We consider two extreme cases to check this conclusion. In case 1, the demand is perfectly inelastic, that is, epsilon equals 0. The tax will not reduce the quantity because the demand for beer is fixed. In case 2, the demand curve is perfectly elastic, that is, epsilon equals negative infinity. The tax will substantially reduce the quantity. Of course, the result also depends on the price elasticity of supply. Let's solve exercise 6.10. The estimated demand function for coffee is Q equals 12 minus P, and the estimated supply function is Q equals 9 plus 0.5 times P. In part A, write equations for the equilibrium price and quantity as a function of a specific tax T. Suppose the specific tax T is imposed on producers. The supply function becomes as follows. The producers must receive a price that is $T higher to supply the same quantity as before the tax. At the after-tax equilibrium, the equilibrium quantity demanded equals the equilibrium quantity supplied. We can solve for the after-tax equilibrium price, which is a function of T. Substituting it into the demand function or the new supply function, we obtain the after-tax equilibrium quantity. It is also a function of T. In part B, what are the equilibrium price and quantity and the tax incidence on consumers if T equals $0.75? We plug in the value of the tax and get the answer. Using the demand function and the pre-tax supply function, we can find the pre-tax price, which is $2. The tax incidence on consumers is 1/3. Consumers bear 1/3 of the tax, and producers pay 2/3 of the tax. Thank you so much for solving the exercises with me today. See you soon in the next part of Chapter 2. Goodbye. Thank you for watching this video and subscribing to my YouTube channel. See you next time.